All right. So I see some other people joining as well. Welcome to this webinar. Thank you for everyone who already joined. We will, of course, also admit other people who will join later. I am Sarah Karamiti from User-Centrics, account executive in the sales international team. And today we are meeting with Sarah Kampf, who is working as legal counsel in User-Centrics. On a funny side, I can assure you that there are also people with other names at User-Centrics, just by a case that we have both the same name. So Sarah, welcome. And we will talk today about some important updates from the Benelux region in terms of data protection for third-party cookies. So first of all, I would like to start with a disclaimer about the fact that this is supposed to be an educational session, and where we are sharing some knowledge with you and some updates regarding these regions. Although it's not supposed to be a substitute for any legal advice, and we still suggest to check with your internal legal team or legal expert within your organization in case you need the legal advice. So the agenda for today will be, we will start with a short recap of what GDPR is. You can, the short description of recap of GDPR, a regulation then specific about Benelux region, and in particular how these differ compared to the GDPR directives, how user-centric CMP could help you achieving this compliance. And we will also love to share some examples of live customers who choose our CMP. So, Sarah, welcome to these sessions, and thank you for being available today to share your knowledge. So, what is GDPR, and which countries does it affect?
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for the question. So, as you probably already know, GDPR stands for General Data Protection Regulation, and this regulation came into effect the 25th of May 2018. This regulation unifies all the rules of all EU countries, and the goal of this regulation is to protect personal data and strengthen privacy rights of EU individuals and give users control over their data. And then to answer your question on which countries it will affect, and if it's only a thing in the EU. So on this slide you see a map of the world, and here we see an overview of current and pending privacy regulations all around the world. This gives a good overview of how massive data privacy is expanding worldwide, and that data privacy is not only a thing in the EU. So, for example, in our company, our legal team is actually checking weekly on new data privacy regulations around the world, just to make sure that we are updated on what is going on worldwide. And many things are happening around the world, I will say. So on the next slide, and if we take a closer look at GDPR, so who is affected by this regulation? And this regulation includes all businesses that collect or hold personal data of EU citizens. Therefore, it doesn't matter where the company is placed, but the question is if the business is actually collecting personal data of EU citizens.
Very interesting point, which I think is not very known by everyone. The fact that it's not important where the data are stored only, but also where the citizens resides. So, and Sarah, which are these data that needs to be regulated, and why do they need to be regulated?
So maybe before we dive deeper into what data is regulated, it is important to mention that any business model that uses personal data is affected by the regulation and exposed to an increasing legal and financial risk. It means that you need to take a closer look at the tracking technology, system, tools that you're using and ask yourself if personal data will be collected and processed. For example, name, email address, IP address, user behavior, and other kind of personal data. And if that is the case, a legal basis is needed for the processing under GDPR Article 6. And of course, in other regulations worldwide, depending on where you as a company is located and what citizens' data you're processing. It means that if you use consent as the legal basis, you cannot process the personal data without a valid consent. And what is personal identifiable information? So, in accordance to Article 4 in GDPR, it is any information relating to an identified or identifiable natural person. And here on this slide, you can also see the definition of an identifiable natural person. So, in other words, if you can identify a person with the information, then it will be seen as personal identifiable information under GDPR. And just to give you an example here, so for example, color, right? So you will probably not see this as personal information, but it can actually be. So for example, if you have a group of people and that only one of them is wearing an orange tie, then you will know what person we are talking about and you can identify this person.
Yeah, very interesting because about color, I think how many times we buy online now and how e-commerce websites or apps might be affected by this. So it's important to remember that also preferences is seen as one of this kind of information. So Sarah, due that I mentioned apps as well, does this data need to be regulated only for websites?
No, and this is a good question. So it does not only need to be regulated for websites. So it also needs to be regulated for the areas shared here on this slide. So including apps, connected TVs, connected cars, and other third-party technologies. So it means that consent is required for all devices using tracking technologies if it collects personal identifiable information.
Yeah, and it's a very good point that I want to highlight because nowadays our life is extremely affected by these smart appliances, and it's important to remember that this data still need to be consented or denied to be processed. So, Sarah, more in particular regarding this regulation, what is a CMP and what are the principles of its compliance?
Okay, so what is a CMP? So a content management platform is a tool that helps websites, apps, and other devices collect and manage users' consent that is required for processing the user's personal data. And what are then the legal requirements for valid consent under GDPR? So what you can see here in this slide is an overview of the requirement for valid consent. So first of all, consent must be freely given. It means that users must have a free choice and must be able to refuse or withdraw consent without being at a disadvantage. Consent also needs to be informed, meaning that it should include all relevant information, for example, the purpose of the processing. A consent also needs to be granular, meaning that a general consent is not valid. Then it needs to be explicit, meaning that implicit consent is not a valid option. You also need prior consent, meaning that technologies not covered by legitimate interest should only be loaded on your website if consent is given. Then consent needs to be as easy to withdraw as it was to give. And last but not least, the business behind, for example, the website owner, must be able to prove that they had consent and that those consent meet the requirement for valid consent. Okay, so to have a valid consent, it needs to be, to fulfill all the requirements listed here. Okay, so if you go to the next slide, what are the basic goals of privacy regulations? So the primary goal is to secure personal data from unauthorized access, use, or disclosure. On this slide, we have listed the user's rights in the gray fields, and then in the blue fields, you see the goals of the user's rights. For example, You have the right to understand and be informed about the processing of your personal data, and you have the right to change and adjust your personal data that the website owner is processing. Okay, so what does it mean for you as a company? It means that you need to protect the personal information processed. You need to ensure that a valid consent is given. You should promote transparency. You should also guarantee the right to access, modify, and delete. Companies should also be held accountable. And last but not least, you must enable safe data transfer.
Very interesting. So we will go back to the slides that we saw, the slide that we saw before this one, when we will talk more in details about the product. But now that we had an overview of GDPR, maybe we can talk about more the specifics of this webinar, which is focused especially on the Benelux region. So let's start maybe with Belgium, the Netherlands and Luxembourg, and see in what they differ from GDPR or in what they are similar to GDPR regulation.
Yeah, and this is an interesting question, right? So let's take a closer look at the requirements for each of the countries, and let's also here focus on the requirements behind trackers and consent. And maybe it's also important here to mention that the requirements in both Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg are actually based on the requirements under GDPR. Okay, so let's first of all take a look at the requirements in Belgium. First of all, they say that the option to reject consent needs to be available on the first layer of the CMP. Consent must also be obtained through a clear, explicit positive action, and users must be fully informed prior to the consent request. You also need to have consent on a granular level, and cookies and trackers should be categorized on a purpose level, for example, statistic and marketing. And then we are talking about double opt-in, meaning that the case when a user signs up for an email marketing list, then an email is sent out to the user, which include a link to click and confirm the subscription. Okay, and in Belgium, double opt-in is also necessary in these cases. Then we're talking about strictly necessary cookies and trackers. And for those, it should be classified under the category called functional and essential. And trackers are actually considered functional when they are essential to send communication or to provide a service requested. And last but not least, it needs to be as easy to withdraw consent as it was to give. Okay, so what is not acceptable? Here they mention that a passive action like continuing scrolling on the website will not be seen as a valid consent. The same goes for pre-check boxes that will not be seen as a valid consent either. And cookie walls are not allowed, and the use of browser settings to indicate consent will not be seen as a valid consent. Okay, so these are the specific requirements in Belgium. So let's take a closer look at the Netherlands and what are the requirements here. So if you can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. First of all, the option to reject needs to be available on the first layer of the CMP. And same as for Belgium, only strictly necessary trackers should be classified as essential or functional. And then it is required that the website operators must maintain consent records and be able to prove that consent was obtained, including then when, how, and what information they received before giving their consent. Okay, so what is not acceptable? So pre-check boxes, passive action as valid consent, and cookie walls as in Belgium. You may not manipulate users into consenting, also called dark patterns and nudging. And if you are using a hitting deny option as a link in text and creates the impression that there is only an accept option, it will not be considered as a valid consent either. Last but not least, conditional consent is prohibited. For example, the case where a user are required to sign up for a newsletter in order to be able to provide or reject consent, and this will not be seen as a valid consent. Okay, so last but not least, let's take a closer look at Luxembourg. And for Luxembourg, we will see most of the requirements like in Belgium and the Netherlands. So for example, the option to reject that need to be available in the first layer. that only strictly necessary trackers should be classified as essential for the website to work, and it needs to be as easy to withdraw consent as given. Also, for the things not acceptable, pre-check boxes and hitting the deny option as a link in the text. And other than that, just highlighting the accept button and not the deny button is not considered as a valid consent from the user. Okay, so now we have looked at the requirements for each of the country for trackers, cookies, and consents. And to give you a better overview of the requirements compared to each other, but also compared to the requirements under EU, we have created the next two slides. So, as you can see, most of the requirements under GDPR are also implemented in Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. And for some of the requirements, nothing specific is stated in the country-specific requirements in Benelux, but this just means that they stick to the requirements under GDPR. So all in all, the requirements under GDPR will also be relevant looking at the country-specific requirements in the Benelux countries.
Thank you, Sarah. And now that we saw the specifics of the Benelux region, what are the risks of not following these guidance, these regulations? Are there any history of fines and any updates on this topic?
Yeah, so in general, if you do not comply with the requirements set under GDPR, it may result in administrative GDPR fines, which may, in theory, amount up to 20 million euros or 4% of the yearly worldwide turnover if this amount is higher. For example, if you are facing a data breach and it is required that you must report the data breach within 72 hours from when you became aware of the breach, and if not, you can face a fine up to 20 million euros or 4% of the global turnover as a company. And more data protection authorities in the EU impose fines under GDPR. And in the next slides, I've listed some of the relevant law enforcement actions in Belgium and the Netherlands, just to give you an overview of what is happening in these countries looking at this area. So if we first take a look at Belgium, so the first example I want to share with you here is from December 2019. And here, the Belgian Data Protection Authority imposed a fine of 15 euros on a website specialized in legal news for their non-compliant cookie management and privacy policy. There's also another example from September this year, where the Belgian Data Protection Authority took action against Mediahuis for illegal use of cookie banners on press websites. In this case, it included the following. So first of all, that the reject all button was missing. Secondly, they could not use misleading button colors. The withdrawal of consent was not easily reachable. And last but not least, they could not use legitimate interest for non-strictly necessary data processing services. And the fine for not being compliant with these requirements set until 46 days after the notification of the decision will be 25,000 euros per day and per non-compliant press site. Okay, and the last example here is from October this year. And here the Belgian Data Protection Authority published a decision on the non-compliance with GDPR and e-privacy of the RTL Belgian website. And here the main focus in this case is that their CMP is about the CMP and the absence of reject button, misleading colors, and not an easily accessible withdraw option. And they have 45 days to implement the changes. And if they do not comply with this, they are fined 40,000 euros per day until the changes are implemented. Okay. So what is happening in the Netherlands looking at law enforcement actions? So the first example is from January this year, where Uber was fined 10 million euros for violating privacy rules. They failed to provide sufficient transparency about how long the company retained data from European drivers and to which countries outside of Europe this data was forwarded. And another example is from July this year, where there was a fine of 290 million euros on Uber because of transfer of drivers' data to the US. The last example here is from September this year, where Clearview was fined for illegal facial recognition data collection. And in this case, the Dutch Data Protection Authority is imposing a fine of 30.5 million euros, as well as a penalty payment for more than 5 million euros. And the reason why is that Clearview has illegally created a database with billions of photos of faces, including people from the Netherlands. Okay, so as you can see, data privacy has gained a bigger focus in Europe during the last years. And I think that in the future, we should expect more cases to come.
Thank you, Sarah, for this overview. Of course, these are crazy numbers and very expensive fines. I want to just repeat what we saw at the beginning of this webinar, of these sessions, that our session is mainly focused on sharing some knowledge and some text that have been published, also the fines that we heard about it, although doesn't substitute any legal advice. But of course, as we are also in the business and we are one of the CMP leading the market, I would also like to talk about how user-centrics could help you, making your life easier, because it's also very hard to keep up with fines, with new regulation and so on. And of course, the benefits of having a third-party solution that does this for you with an exceptional legal team that I want to thank you here as well for being amazing and keeping up with this new regulation weekly. It's of course would be a big benefit for companies. So if we can start with the product description, this will be of course a high-level overview, because I would like also to mention that of course if you are interested in knowing more about user-centric products, we can also feel free to schedule a demo with us and so on, and discuss more in details also the specifics of your business. But basically, I would like to start with the slide that Sarah also used, because these are the requirements that we have to apply to be compliant when talking about CMP, Consent Management Platform. So freely informed, granular, explicit, prior, easy to opt out, and documented. And if we see the next one, the next slide here. So how does user-centrics product help you with these requirements? First of all, the high level of customization that is possible with user-centrics products. I'm not talking only about the web, but all the products that are in our portfolio are easy to use out of the box, as a solution out of the box with a minimum level of customization. Also, for example, from a small company with a small traffic till a high level of customization for enterprise companies. And this, of course, allows you to decide things like the position of the banner, which legal framework to use. I think of course, GDPR, as we spoke, and of course, Benelux is in the EU, but also TCF in case you use advertising on your website, on your media. We provide with the DPS templates, which, although do not substitute the regulation itself, they can definitely help you with adding relevant information in your banner. You can also customize categories, create new ones, and change the description of the categories in a way that is more compliant, but also at the same time better for your company. The next one. So some examples here of the topics that we discussed with Sarah as well, some of these requirements, the granularity. So in user-centric product, in user-centric CMP, you can display the granularity, for example, on the category and on the service level. And this will allow you to inform your users about which content has been, which content is tracked, and you can also adapt these with automatic translations, for example, in more than 60 languages. You can use, for example, a language switch. So your CMP would be displayed, I think about, for example, Luxembourg has 3 languages by default, and you could add one CMP, one banner with 3 different languages, or Netherlands as well, and Benelux is also French and Flemish. So you could add different languages, and the consent that has to be explicit. For example, the user has, of course, a clear option to accept or deny through a click or toggle activation or different customization. That again, we can talk more in details through a demo or some material that I can send you if you wish to. But the consent has also has to be prior documented, as we saw. So in our CMP, the user has indeed the ability to read about vendor information, know what these third-party cookies are tracking, even before interacting with the website. And as well, of course, user-centrics being one of the first CMP providers authorized by Google, also the consent is documented and possible to be retrieved. So the consent also needs to be informed, one of the other requirements that we saw with Sarah before. So here you can see, for example, an example of the information about the vendor. So it doesn't have to be so detailed. This is just an example, but of course, the user will be informed about what is consenting for. Next one, please. And this is an example of the level of customization. So everyone knows that in Europe it's GDPR, the framework that we will need, although there are quite a few regional differences. GDPR is, of course, a stricter regulation, right, Sarah? But again, you can decide, for example, to show GDPR also to all the users, because as a choice, you can also decide this. And then on the category level, we can help you with the creation of additional category, legal templates, as I was mentioning before, and DPS details, for example, and so on. Next one, please. And also one of the most important facts is to remember that, as we saw today, the CMP is mandatory on all devices that use these third-party data. And it's important to remember that and to mention that user-centrics can help you also with the app. This is one of the overview of our app CMP, but also with TV and the PMP for preference management, especially in the e-commerce. Next one, and here are some of our logos. In the Benelux, of course, we have much more, but these are the main one in the Benelux region. I want to thank them all also. Thank you for being with us, for choosing user-centrics. And next one. Yes, I want to say thank you in all the Benelux languages. Dank je wel and merci, danke. And I would like to mention that if you would like to have more information, or if you would like to go more deeper into some of the topics that we discussed today, please feel free to write me directly. I can offer you a demo of our product. And also worth to mention that we have a Christmas promo till the 15th of December. So thank you very much. And thank you to the legal team for working together on this, and the marketing team who helped with the promotion. And I hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.